get my glasses on the first thing tonight. Got up Sunday morning. I don't know if anybody noticed it or not, but I got about halfway through the lesson. I had to look at my notes, and I looked down at them, and I couldn't read them, and there was my glasses laying there in the case. And I said, well, time out for the glasses to put them on. But I got them on now, and I can see all of you like this fine, but when I'm trying to read, I can't do it. Hope everybody's doing well tonight. We have some people that are suffering with the flu, and we'll be announcing those later, and have some news about the hospitals and all of that. A couple have come home from the hospital, and we're thankful for that. Derek Cripley had knee surgery. You may have not heard that, and knee replacement, and he's back home already. Had surgery yesterday, and he's recuperating, and we wish him well. R.W. has the flu, and Elaine has the flu, and we hope everybody else will be much better. Matthew chapters 8 and 9. I want you to turn there and be looking at these two chapters with us tonight as we continue to look at the book of Matthew and trying to learn some lessons from it. Studied the Sermon on the Mount, the teachings of Jesus, and now we come to the actions of Jesus, where he is doing so many great and mighty miracles and demonstrating the authority that he has over all things. And he had taught as one who had authority, and now he is demonstrating that. I like to draw lessons from the material that we study that will help us, and I mentioned a couple last time, and just about the time I began talking about how Jesus met with criticism, as is pointed out in chapter 9, especially verses 11, 24, and 34, and how we're to react to criticism, because Christians can be criticized today, and we have to learn how to deal with criticism just as Jesus had to deal with it. We mentioned in verse 11 the Pharisees criticizing Jesus for eating with publicans and sinners, and the fact that they say, how is it that your master, your teacher, eats with publicans and sinners? There's an emphasis on that that's evident. They did not view themselves as sinners, and so if he doesn't eat with us, that means that we're good people. We're not sinners, and they didn't recognize who they really were. And anyway, they criticized him for doing that, but he pointed out to them, those that are whole need not a physician, and those that are righteous, they don't need a teacher to teach them. Those that, are all right, they don't maybe have a need. But if they're sinners, people who are sinners need a Savior. And we all need to remember that. In chapter 9, verse 24, when Jesus said the maid is not dead but sleeps, they laughed him to scorn, Matthew said. And there are people that scorn the idea of Christians today and the things that we believe, teach, and practice. There was a woman I noticed being quoted in reference to a person saying something about Jesus speaking to them. And she said, when you're talking to Jesus, that's all right, but when Jesus speaks to you, you're crazy. Something wrong with you. You're crazy. And of course, he was talking about Jesus speaking to us through his word. We've emphasized in our studies that God speaks to us through his Son. So he does speak to us today. Some of you may have heard me tell about the people that we were studying with one night, and there was a fellow of another persuasion who was invited in, and I said, well, sure, let him come, we'll talk. And we were talking, and he began asking if Jesus, if God spoke to us, or spoke to me in our service, I said, sure. Every time we meet, He speaks to me. And he said, really? Couldn't believe it. I said, well, yes. I said, every time that the Bible is taught, God is speaking to us through His Son. Oh, I don't mean like that. I said, how do you mean? He said, I mean actually speaks to you. I said, does He to you? He said, oh, yeah, all the time. I said, what did He say? I want you to tell me exactly what He said. Well, you know. No, I don't know. I want you to tell me what He said. I want you to tell me how His voice sounded. He said, what do you mean? I said, is it low and deep, or is it high-pitched? If He spoke to you literally, I want to know how His voice sounded. And he said, well, if I told you, you wouldn't believe me anyway. I said, well, you try me and tell me. I just kept pushing him a little bit because I wanted him to see that God speaks to us through His Word. He speaks to us. He doesn't speak in an audible voice. And I finally told him, I said, if God had actually spoken to you, He'd probably scared you to death. You probably wouldn't have been here today. I believe He would too, Johnny. I sure do. But He couldn't do it. But God does speak to us through His Son. And when Jesus said, she sleeps, they didn't understand that He was using it in a metaphorical sense, in a figurative sense. Death is often described in the Scriptures as sleep. But they laughed Him to scorn, but it didn't stop Him from doing what He was going to do. So there will be people who will criticize you. There will be people who will scorn you. There will be people who will laugh at you and mock you. And then in the last situation, in verse 34, the Pharisees again said, He casts out devils through the prince of the devils. They try to discredit your work and what you're doing. Many of you know of my admiration for the late Brother Franklin Camp. He held a couple of meetings here. And while he was here for one time, he told me the story. We had the radio program every day then. I invited him to speak on the radio program. And we were talking about things that happened. And he told me about an incident when he was a relatively young preacher that happened in Alabama, where this man was preaching a false doctrine, and Brother Camp came on right after him, and he would answer him and refute him. And he was of Pentecostal persuasion, and teaching the miraculous and speaking in tongues and all of that. And Brother Camp just answered him every day. And he said finally, the old man, or the older fellow came on, and he said one morning, said, the very old devil is after me, trying to discredit what I'm speaking, The very old devil is after me. Well, Brother Camp came on, and he said, well, you all have heard what our friend has said, and he has called me the devil, but that puts me in good company, because there were people who told Jesus, you cast out demons by the power of the devil. And he said, I consider that a compliment. And anyway, there's so many things that go on. We can be criticized. And the Pharisees were really harsh critics. They excelled at criticism. And as we mentioned, they laid heavy burdens on others but wouldn't lift a finger to assist them. We talked about constructive criticism and destructive criticism, but I want you to be aware of the fact, this was the final point that I wanted to make. Last time didn't have time. Criticism can come from within and from without. We can be criticized by people outside the church. We can be criticized by people inside the church. Sometimes criticism can be well-intentioned but hurtful. Sometimes it can be very constructive. I've received constructive criticism. I'm sure just about all of you have at one time or the other. All of us need that occasion. But we shouldn't major in criticism, should we? We shouldn't just become critical people. We should be those who look for the good. And in the very worst of people, you will find something good. You know the story about the fellow who was a good whistler. So we can always find something good in people, and we need to look for them. We need to be careful about criticizing our brothers and sisters in Christ. Jesus is our example in that. He's always our example. We need to be careful about criticizing others, period, because criticism can be hurtful and harmful and destructive. And criticism can be especially detrimental in families. You know, I've heard people criticize their spouses, both men and women. I've heard parents criticize their children. You know, and you can talk about those things and work them out within the family, but it's not good to be overly critical. And we need to be careful about how we react to criticism. Here's a rule of thumb that I've tried to always use. Listen to your critics, but don't let them rule you. You can listen and learn from them, but don't allow critics to dictate what you do and how you live, you know. If you live in pleasing to the Lord, there's going to be people who criticize. You know, I remember a particular person that was always smiling and you know, friendly to everybody. And there was one person in the community who said, "I wish he'd wipe that silly smile off his face." And I mean, that was just his demeanor. And needless to say, that person hardly ever had a smile on her face. You know, but criticism can become contagious. And if we're around people a lot that criticize others a lot, we can fall into that trap. And we need not do that. Barbara used to tell me about a woman that used to live in the Baghdad community, and attend services there. And after she mentioned it, I began to notice this. She said, "I have never heard her say anything critical about anybody." And we ate in her house several times. And somebody might bring up something about, you know, someone that nobody there knew. Might have been somebody about that was on TV or something. And people would be, you know, making critical remarks about it and or about that person. And this woman would say, "Well, have you ever thought?" And she'd come up with something positive, you know. And I mentioned the sermon that I heard on Lot's wife the other night down at Rome. And when I came out, I told the preacher, I said, "I appreciate the lesson." I said, "I want to tell you a quick story." Told him about when I first moved to Carthage. We would have a ladies' Bible class every week. And we'd meet back in where the annex is now. Might have been in the room where my office is now. But anyway, we met back there. And one week we were wearing Lot's wife out. I mean, I was giving her a hard way to go. And Sister Dorothy Rutherford, we got to a certain point, and she said, you know, she had to watch her husband really suffer. And wheels started turning. I thought, you know, all the years I've heard sermons preached on Job's wife, I'd never heard that thought expressed. And I've never forgotten that. You know, it gives us a different perspective. But you know, the thing about Lot's wife, she went through all of that. She lost her sons and daughters too. She suffered everything, and she saw her husband suffer intensely all that time. But the point that was made by the brother down at Rome was, you know, he's talking about these women who sing about stand by your man. Remember Tammy Wynette? How many times was she married? 5 times. To the same man twice. But anyway, he said, now if you really want to see a woman who stands by her man, you study the book of Job. Because Job is blessed with more sons and daughters. Guess who had them? Mrs. Job did. So, we can be critical of people in the Bible sometimes without realizing, what they went through. Give you an illustration. It's an old one. Some of you may have heard it, but just pretend you hadn't. The preacher went by to see the old farmer who hadn't been coming to church, and told him, we really miss you. We wish you'd come to church and be there for our services. He said, well, I tell you, preacher, there's a lot of people there that's really not what they ought to be. I don't claim to be a good man, but I'm just as good or better than they are. And so I probably won't be coming. Preacher said, well, just think about it. Preacher came back in a week and he said, farmer, I'm going to hog business. I'm going to buy me a pig. Farmer said, well, all right, I got brand new litter down here. About ready to sell, just come on down. Took him down there and showed him this nice litter of pigs. He said, just pick out any one you want. The old preacher said, I want that one right there. He said, preacher, you don't want that pig. That's the runt. He said, I know it. I want that pig. That's the one I want to buy. He said, well, what are you going to do with a pig like that? He said, I'm going to load him up. I'm going to haul him all over the county and tell everybody that that's the kind of pigs you raise. That little old runty, scrawny-looking little old pig. He said, but I got all these real good pigs. He said, yep, same way at church. We got a lot of good people, and you pick out the sorriest ones to compare everybody else to, so you won't mind if I just compare all of your pigs to this one. The guy got the point, didn't he? That's so many times, though, that's the way we live. We're critical, overly critical. And let's strive not to be that way. There's some questions that people pose about things that are said in chapters 8 and 9. I want to talk to you about some of those. I want you to notice a couple of questions that are posed in chapter 9 by these people. We mentioned the scribes and Pharisees, or the Pharisees in particular. In chapter 9, verse 11, you will notice that they ask, why does your master eat with publicans and sinners? Why does your master eat with publicans and sinners? Jesus heard what they had said in verses 12 and 13, and he said, they that be whole need not a physician, but they that are sick. But go you and learn what that means. I will have mercy and not sacrifice. For I am not come to call the righteous, but sinners to repentance. The Pharisees didn't understand the principle of mercy. They thought a lot about offering sacrifices, but they had forgotten the principle of mercy. Didn't realize that they themselves needed it. Jesus said, you go and learn about this. Here's something you hadn't thought about, something you don't know, that you don't understand. You need to learn about that. And then in chapter 9, verse 14, there came to him the disciples of John, saying, why do we and the Pharisees fast oft, but your disciples fast not? And Jesus answered them, can the children of the bride chamber mourn as long as the bridegroom is with them? But the days will come when the bridegroom shall be taken from them, and then shall they fast. They're going to fast after he's gone, not while he's there. And then, no man puts a piece of new cloth into an old garment. For that which is put in to fill it up takes from the garment, and the rent is made worse. Neither do men put new wine into old bottles, else the bottles break, the wine runs out, and the bottles perish. But they put new wine into new bottles, and both are preserved. New system's about to be set up. The Pharisees didn't understand that. They didn't appreciate the doing away of the principle of doing away of the old law and the bringing in of the new. But here's a question that sometimes is posed about Jesus healing the leper. Why did he tell the leper to tell no one about this miracle? He said, after he'd healed him, he said, don't tell anybody. Why did Jesus sometimes tell people not to tell something? And why did he sometimes suggest that they go and tell? Why the difference? Anybody have any thoughts on that? Why might it be? Why did he tell him, don't tell anybody about this? Nobody ever thought about that? That's right. This fellow did. This fellow did. You know. Why wouldn't you tell people, you know, I've been cleansed of leprosy? But how do we dissect? I think Barry's on the right track. I really do. He normally is. And but this is not the only occasion that this was done. Jesus told several people. There are several instances here in the book of Matthew, in chapter 9, verse 30. You read, and their eyes were opened, and Jesus straightly charged them, saying, see that no man know it. Basically saying, don't tell anybody. If you turn over to Matthew 16, this is in connection with Jesus talking about the establishment of the church and so on. In Matthew 16, I believe it's verse 20, he's just said now, I will give unto you the keys of the kingdom of heaven, and whatsoever you bind on earth shall be bound in heaven, whatsoever you loose on earth shall be loosed in heaven. Then charged he his disciples that they should tell no man that he was Jesus the Christ. And I think this ties in with what Barry has suggested, and that is, it was not his time to die. And certainly the Pharisees and perhaps the Roman authorities as well, if they had thought that there was an insurrectionist in their midst, it might have caused them to have hastened the death of Jesus. But of course, there was sort of a timetable for that. But there's another thing, too, that I think is involved in addition to the timing of it. We need to keep in mind that according to Matthew chapter 11, the healing of the lepers would be one of the primary signs that the Messiah had truly come. Turn over there to chapter 11 and look at verses 2 through 6. Now when John had heard in the prison the works of Christ, he sent two of his disciples and said unto him, art thou he that should come, or do we look for another? And Jesus answered and said unto them, go and show John again those things which you do hear and see. The blind receive their sight, and the lame walk. The lepers are cleansed, and the deaf hear. The dead are raised up, and the poor have the gospel preached to them. And blessed is he whosoever shall not be offended in me. Now, the lepers being cleansed was a positive proof that the Messiah was in their midst. And so that was given to the disciples of John, who in turn would return and reassure him that indeed the Messiah was there. I think that the stronger opposition would have developed to Jesus' work and his teachings had these things been broadcast more rapidly. A writer by the name of R.C. Trench, I believe his name was Richard C. Trench, but he is quoted by Brother Kaufman as saying, "The injunction to one that he should proclaim, to another that he should conceal the great things which God had wrought for him, had far more probably a deeper motive and grounded itself on the different moral conditions of the person healed." That is, it may have depended upon the individual. Solomon maybe illustrates that principle a little bit. He said on one occasion, "Answer a fool according to his folly." But within the same immediate context, he said, "Answer a fool according to his folly." Answer not a fool according to his folly. Answer a fool according to his folly. And I don't understand exactly why that is stated as it is, but we do know that there are differences in people. And sometimes that's what I was doing when I was talking to that man about the Lord speaking directly to him. I was trying to get him to think. And sometimes if you answer a man according to his folly, maybe it shakes his roots a little bit and gets him to thinking a little bit differently. Brother Dwight Stamps used to tell me the first time he heard V.P. Black preach, he said, "I got so mad I couldn't see straight." He made me mad. And I heard him tell Brother Black the same thing when he was here in the meeting. Brother Black smiled and said, "Yeah, but now you're a Christian, aren't you?" Brother Walton Agee told me one time when I was a young preacher, he said, "The best thing you can do for some people is make them mad." And I've heard R.W. Vincent say that Charles White, he bothered me so much that I just sometimes wanted to walk out when I saw him coming. I think he did a time or two. But he said, man, he just kept on. He was persistent. He said, now I'm a Christian. You know. And so people are different. There's differences in people. The sun shines on the wax and melts it, shines on the clay, and it hardens. And that's just the way people are. Yeah, W.A. would probably say amen to that he, first few times he heard the gospel, there was some woman that had a big influence on him too. You know, but people are different. And I think Jesus took that into consideration. Trench also made this observation. He said that for the miracle to be properly attested, the man cleansed would need to hold his peace until the proper priestly functions had been performed and he was declared clean and whole. He had to go to the priest. Jesus told him to present himself to the priest. And the sacrifices had to be offered. Now, imagine if that man had gone to the priest and said, Jesus of Nazareth has cleansed me. The priest could have declared him not clean because of his prejudice toward Jesus. But when the priest declared him to be cleansed, then none of the Jews could say, oh, you know, he hadn't been cleansed. He hadn't been healed. The priest said, this man's been healed. So now you have a Jewish leader proclaiming that the miracle had actually been performed. So you can see why Jesus may have said, don't tell anybody and it may be implied, until you have presented yourself to the priest. And that may be the reason that the man was not chastised later by Jesus for telling others about it. But parallel accounts reveal that the former leper spread the news. Did he do it before or after he'd gone to the priest? We don't know. But whatever the case, the notoriety of Jesus' work forced him to have to go to other places. He was in a very populous area. Capernaum and that general area was heavily populated. And so he had to go to some other places. Luke records that the centurion that we read about and talked about sent some of the Jewish leaders to Jesus to make his request for the healing of his servant. And there's some people who question the parallel accounts in Matthew and Luke. That's in Luke 7, verses 4 through 5. But these two accounts are easily reconciled. There are people who talk about the contradictions in the Bible. Always remember, nothing can be labeled a contradiction if there is a logical explanation for it. And that's something that most people forget when they look at two accounts and they say, well, the centurion is said by Matthew to have come, Well, if you notice, John asked the question, of Jesus, art thou he that should come, or do we look for another? John asked Jesus that question, but he did it through two of his disciples. The question is attributed to John, not the disciples. They were acting under his direction. And the same thing is explained by Brother Leon Morris when he says, what a man does through agents, he may be said to do himself. So what Matthew does is give the gist of the centurion's communication with Jesus, but Luke gives in greater detail the actual sequence of events that transpired. So compare those two cases, if you would. But we appreciate you being here tonight, and the second bell has rung. We appreciate your interest, and we hope you'll be back next week.